The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy naval base cafeteria as Thomas Martinez wiped down the serving counters for what felt like the 1,000th time that week. At 68 years old, his weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, each motion deliberate and careful. The white apron tied around his waist was spotless, just like everything else in his section of the kitchen. Thomas took pride in his work, even if it was just serving food to young sailors who barely looked his way. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual morning energy. Hundreds of sailors, officers, and base personnel filed through the serving line, grabbing their breakfast trays and moving on to find seats. Thomas stood behind the steam tables, quietly spooning scrambled eggs, hash browns, and bacon onto plates. His voice was soft when he asked each person what they wanted, and his smile was genuine, though most people were too busy or too tired to notice. Thomas had been working at the naval base cafeteria for almost 15 years now. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and kept him busy during his retirement years. Most people assumed he was just another civilian food service worker, someone who had probably worked in kitchens his whole life. They saw his graying hair, his slight stoop from years of standing, and his quiet manner, and they made their assumptions. Thomas never corrected them. He preferred it that way. The truth was far more complex than anyone realized. Thomas Martinez had served his country for 30 years before hanging up his uniform. He had been places and done things that most people could only imagine. But those days felt like a lifetime ago, and Thomas had learned to live with his memories in silence. The young sailors he served reminded him of himself at their age, full of hope and determination, ready to take on the world. As the morning rush continued, Thomas noticed the usual mix of people coming through his line. There were the fresh-faced recruits, barely out of high school, who still looked amazed to be on a real naval base. There were the seasoned petty officers who moved with confidence and purpose. And there were the officers, some young and eager, others carrying themselves with the weight of command responsibility. Thomas served them all with the same quiet respect. He never played favorites, never engaged in the casual conversation that some of the other cafeteria workers enjoyed with the regular customers. He simply did his job, served good food, and tried to make sure everyone got what they needed to start their day properly. Around mid-morning, as the breakfast rush was winding down, Thomas began his routine of cleaning and preparing for the lunch service. He restocked the serving utensils, wiped down the sneeze guards, and made sure everything was ready for the next wave of hungry personnel. The work was repetitive, but Thomas found comfort in the routine. It kept his mind occupied and his hands busy. The cafeteria had become quieter now, with only a few stragglers coming through for late breakfast or early coffee. Thomas used this time to deep clean his work area, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. The other kitchen staff knew better than to disturb him during these moments. Thomas was friendly enough, but he clearly preferred to work alone when possible. As he cleaned, Thomas's mind wandered to his small apartment off base. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it was his. The walls were mostly bare, except for a few family photos and one small American flag in a simple frame. Thomas had deliberately kept his living space free of reminders of his military service. He had packed away his uniforms, his medals, and most of his military memorabilia years ago. It was easier that way, easier to focus on the present rather than dwelling on the past. The lunch preparation began around 11 o'clock, and Thomas shifted his attention to helping the cooks prepare the day's menu. He worked efficiently, chopping vegetables, preparing salads, and setting up the serving line for the afternoon meal. His knife skills were precise. His movements, economical. Some of the younger kitchen staff had commented on his technique over the years, noting how he seemed to know exactly what he was doing despite claiming to have learned everything on the job. Thomas had always deflected such observations with a modest smile and a comment about paying attention to the real cooks. He never mentioned that he had spent years cooking for his unit in various remote locations around the world, or that he had learned to prepare meals under conditions that would challenge even experienced chefs. Those skills had served him well in his current job, but they also represented a part of his life he preferred to keep private. The lunch rush began promptly at noon, and once again, Thomas found himself behind the serving line, ladling soup and serving sandwiches to the steady stream of base personnel. Today's menu featured chicken noodle soup, grilled cheese sandwiches, and a hearty beef stew that had been simmering since early morning. The smell filled the cafeteria, and Thomas could see the appreciation on people's faces as they approached his station. Among the regular faces, Thomas noticed some new ones. A group of visiting officers from another base had arrived the night before, and they were getting their first taste of the local cafeteria's offerings. Thomas served them with his usual quiet professionalism, making sure their portions were generous and their orders were exactly what they requested. One of the visiting officers, a commander with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, seemed to study Thomas more carefully than most. The man's gaze lingered for a moment, as if he was trying to place a familiar face or remember something important. Thomas felt the scrutiny, but continued serving without acknowledging it. He had learned long ago that sometimes it was better to remain invisible, to blend into the background and let life move around him. The commander moved through the line, selected his lunch, and found a seat with his colleagues. Thomas continued serving the steady stream of personnel, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Several times throughout the lunch service, he noticed the commander's eyes on him, studying him with an intensity that made Thomas slightly uncomfortable. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas tried to dismiss the feeling. It wasn't unusual for people to study the cafeteria staff occasionally. Sometimes they were just bored while waiting in line. Sometimes they were trying to remember if they had seen someone before. Thomas had learned not to read too much into such moments. The lunch rush eventually subsided, and Thomas began his afternoon cleaning routine. He worked methodically, clearing the serving line, washing dishes, and preparing for the dinner service that would begin in a few hours. The work was physical and demanding, but Thomas had stayed in good shape despite his age. His daily routine of walking to and from work, combined with the constant activity of his job, had kept him fit and healthy. As he worked, Thomas reflected on how different his life had become. There was a time when his days had been filled with briefings, training exercises, and the constant awareness that his next assignment might take him halfway around the world on short notice. Now his biggest concern was making sure the soup didn't run out during the dinner rush and that the serving area stayed clean and organized. The transition hadn't been easy at first. After 30 years of military structure and clear hierarchies, civilian life had felt strange and unmoored. Thomas had tried several different jobs before finding his place in the base cafeteria. There was something comforting about still being connected to the military world, even in this small way. He could see the dedication and professionalism of the young sailors and remember what it felt like to be part of something bigger than himself. The dinner preparation began around 4 o'clock, and Thomas joined the kitchen staff in preparing the evening meal. Tonight's menu included roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and fresh dinner rolls. The smell of the roasting chicken filled the kitchen, and Thomas found himself thinking about meals he had shared with his fellow servicemen in mess halls around the world. As the dinner service approached, Thomas noticed that the visiting officers were still on base. They had spent the day in meetings and tours, and now they were returning to the cafeteria for their evening meal. Thomas prepared himself for another busy service, making sure everything was ready and organized. The dinner rush began right on schedule, and Thomas took his position behind the serving line. The roast chicken was popular, and he worked quickly to keep up with demand while ensuring that each plate was properly portioned and attractively presented. His movements were smooth and efficient, the result of years of practice both in this job and in his previous life. The visiting commander appeared in line again, this time accompanied by the base's commanding officer. The two men were deep in conversation about ship movements and logistics, their voices low but their body language indicating the importance of their discussion. Thomas served them both with his usual quiet professionalism, though he noticed the visiting commander's eyes on him once again. After serving the officers, Thomas continued with the steady stream of personnel. The evening crowd was usually more relaxed than the lunch rush, with people having more time to enjoy their meals and conversation. Thomas appreciated the slightly slower pace, as it allowed him to be more thoughtful about his service and to ensure that everyone received exactly what they wanted. As the evening service continued, Thomas noticed the visiting commander had finished his meal but remained seated, occasionally glancing toward the serving line. The base's commanding officer had left, probably returning to his duties, but the visitor seemed in no hurry to leave the cafeteria. Thomas tried not to let the attention bother him. He focused on his work, serving each customer with care and maintaining his professional demeanor. But there was something about the commander's persistent interest that made him feel exposed, as if a carefully maintained facade might be about to crack. The evening rush finally ended and Thomas began his closing duties. He cleaned the serving line, stored leftover food properly, and helped with the general cleanup of the kitchen area. It was nearly 8 o'clock when he finished his work, hung up his apron, and prepared to leave for the night. As Thomas walked through the now quiet cafeteria toward the exit, he noticed the visiting commander was still there, now sitting alone with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be some paperwork spread on the table before him. The man looked up as Thomas passed, and their eyes met briefly. Thomas nodded politely and continued toward the door, eager to get home and put the day behind him. Thomas walked slowly back to where the visiting commander stood waiting, his mind racing through possibilities of what this conversation might be about. The cafeteria was nearly empty now, with only a few staff members finishing their cleaning duties in the kitchen area. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter in the quiet space, and Thomas could hear the distant sound of dishes being washed and equipment being shut down for the night. The commander gestured to a chair across from where he had been sitting, and Thomas sat down carefully, keeping his posture straight despite the casual setting. Years of military training had ingrained certain habits that never truly faded, even after all this time in civilian clothes. The commander settled back into his own chair, studying Thomas with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "I'm Admiral James Patterson," the man said, extending his hand across the table. Thomas shook it firmly, noting the strength in the older man's grip and the calluses that spoke of someone who still maintained physical standards despite his rank. "And you are?" the Admiral asked, though Thomas suspected the man already knew more about him than he was letting on. "Thomas Martinez," he replied simply, his voice steady but cautious. "I work in the cafeteria here." He deliberately kept his response brief, offering no additional information that wasn't specifically requested. Old habits of operational security ran deep, even in what should have been a simple conversation. Admiral Patterson nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "Yes, I gathered that much. You've been working here for quite some time, I'm told. 15 years or so." The question was casual enough, but Thomas detected an undertone that suggested this wasn't idle curiosity. "About that, yes, sir," Thomas confirmed, automatically using the respectful address, despite no longer being bound by military protocol. Some responses were too deeply embedded to change, regardless of circumstances. "It's good work. Keeps me busy." He hoped his tone conveyed that he was content with his current situation and had no desire to discuss his past. The Admiral leaned back slightly in his chair, seemingly relaxed, but Thomas could sense the careful attention behind the casual manner. "I couldn't help but notice something today," Patterson said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "When you were serving lunch, I caught a glimpse of a tattoo on your forearm. Just a small portion visible when your sleeve shifted. Thomas felt his heart rate increase slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. He knew exactly which tattoo the Admiral was referring to, and he understood now why the man had been studying him so intently throughout the day. The small anchor and eagle design on his left forearm wasn't particularly visible most of the time, hidden as it was by his long-sleeved work shirts. But apparently it had been exposed just enough to catch the attention of someone who knew what to look for. "I have several tattoos," Thomas said carefully, neither confirming nor denying anything specific. "Got them when I was younger. Different times, you know." He hoped the Admiral would accept this explanation and let the matter drop. But something in the man's expression told him that wasn't likely to happen. Admiral Patterson leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "The design I saw, Thomas, isn't something you'd find in just any tattoo parlor. In fact, it's quite specific to a particular unit, a particular time and place." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm familiar with that insignia because I served alongside some men who wore the same one. Good men, brave men." Thomas felt the walls he had carefully built around his past beginning to crack. He had always known this day might come, when someone would recognize the signs of his former life and ask questions he wasn't prepared to answer, but he had hoped to keep his two worlds separate for much longer, perhaps forever. "A lot of people got tattoos in the service," Thomas said, his voice still steady, but with a slight edge of defensiveness. "Doesn't necessarily mean anything special. Young men do foolish things sometimes." Even as he said it, he knew the Admiral wouldn't be satisfied with such a dismissive response. Patterson smiled slightly, but it wasn't a mocking expression. Instead, it seemed to convey understanding and perhaps a touch of sympathy. "Thomas, I'm not here to cause you any trouble or to disrupt the life you've built for yourself. But that tattoo represents something very specific. It's the insignia of the Naval Special Warfare Unit that operated in Southeast Asia during some very difficult operations in the 1980s and 1990s. The words hung in the air between them, and Thomas felt decades of carefully maintained silence pressing against his chest. He had worked so hard to put that part of his life behind him, to become just another anonymous civilian worker going through the motions of a quiet retirement. But here was someone who not only recognized the symbols of his past, but seemed to understand their significance. "Even if that were true," Thomas said slowly, "it was a long time ago. Different life, different person. I'm just a cafeteria worker now." He hoped his tone would convey that he wanted the conversation to end, but Admiral Patterson showed no signs of backing down. "I understand the desire for privacy," the Admiral said, his voice gentle but persistent. "I really do. After what some of you boys went through, the need to disappear and live quietly makes perfect sense. But Thomas, I think you should know why I'm really here, why I came to this base." Thomas waited, saying nothing, but his body language betrayed his tension. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, were now clenched slightly, and his shoulders had straightened in a way that suggested he was preparing for something unpleasant. Admiral Patterson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder, placing it on the table but not opening it immediately. "3 weeks ago, I received a very unusual request through official channels. Someone was looking for information about a man named Thomas Martinez, who had served in naval special warfare during the 1980s and 1990s. The request came with very limited information, but it included a physical description and some details about his service record." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. He had always known that his military records existed somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of government files, but he had assumed they were buried too deeply for anyone to access them easily. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Thomas, the Admiral said gently. "The request came from the family of Lieutenant Commander Michael Reynolds. Does that name mean anything to you?" The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Mike Reynolds had been his commanding officer during some of the most dangerous operations of his career. They had served together for nearly 5 years, through missions that had tested both their professional skills and their personal courage. Mike had been more than just a commanding officer. He had been a mentor, a friend, and one of the few people who had truly understood the costs of the work they were doing. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to maintain his composure, but the memories were flooding back despite his efforts to keep them buried. "Mike died 12 years ago," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Heart attack. I read about it in the Navy Times." Admiral Patterson nodded solemnly. Yes, he did. But before he died, Mike apparently told his family stories about his service, about the men he had served with. He spoke particularly highly of a sailor named Thomas Martinez, someone he credited with saving his life on more than one occasion. Thomas looked up sharply, his carefully maintained emotional control beginning to slip. Mike had been like a big brother to him during those difficult years. Someone who had helped him navigate not just the dangers of their missions, but the psychological challenges of the work they were doing. The idea that Mike had spoken about him to his family was both touching and deeply troubling. "Mike's daughter, Sarah, is getting married next month," Admiral Patterson continued. "She's marrying a young Marine officer, actually. She wanted to invite some of her father's old comrades to the wedding, to have people there who knew him during his service years. She's been trying to track down the men her father spoke about most often." The weight of this revelation settled on Thomas like a heavy blanket. He had successfully hidden from his past for 15 years, convinced himself that those relationships and connections were gone forever. The idea that Mike's family was actively looking for him created a mix of emotions he wasn't prepared to handle. "I can't," Thomas said simply, shaking his head. "I don't do that anymore. I don't go to military functions or reunions or anything like that. I'm just not that person now." His voice carried a finality that suggested the conversation should end there. But Admiral Patterson wasn't finished. "Thomas, I understand the reluctance. I really do. After some of the missions you boys ran, the desire to disappear completely makes perfect sense. But there's something else you should know about Sarah Reynolds. She's not just looking for her father's old friends out of nostalgia." Thomas waited, dreading what might come next, but unable to stop himself from listening. "Sarah is a social worker now, specializing in helping veterans transition to civilian life. She's particularly focused on helping special operations veterans who are struggling with isolation and disconnection from their past service. Her father's stories about his time in the teams inspired her career choice." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Here was Mike's daughter, working to help people exactly like him, people who had served in units like theirs and were now struggling to find their place in the civilian world. The fact that she was actively looking for him took on new significance in this context. "She doesn't want to intrude on anyone's privacy," Admiral Patterson continued. "But she believes that maintaining connections with people who shared those experiences can be important for long-term well-being. She's seen too many veterans who isolated themselves completely and struggled as a result." Thomas sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. The simple life he had built for himself suddenly felt both precious and fragile. He had worked so hard to create a peaceful existence, free from the memories and complications of his military service. But sitting across from Admiral Patterson, hearing about Mike's family and their desire to connect with his past, Thomas felt the pull of old loyalties and relationships. "How did you find me?" Thomas asked finally, his voice resigned to the fact that his anonymity was no longer possible. Admiral Patterson smiled slightly. "It wasn't easy, I'll give you that. Your transition to civilian life was very thoroughly done, but Sarah Reynolds is persistent. And she has connections in the veteran services community. When traditional channels didn't work, she reached out through military networks. Eventually, someone remembered hearing about a Thomas Martinez who had worked at various military installations after his retirement. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding now how the pieces had come together. He had always been careful about his employment, deliberately choosing jobs that would keep him connected to the military community in small ways while maintaining his anonymity. But that same choice had ultimately provided the breadcrumbs that led to his discovery. "What exactly does she want from me?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "She wants to meet you," Admiral Patterson said simply. "She wants to hear stories about her father that only someone who served with him could tell. And Thomas, I think she wants to thank you for whatever you did to help bring her father home safe from those missions you ran together." The weight of responsibility settled on Thomas's shoulders. He had spent 15 years trying to forget about Lieutenant Commander Michael Reynolds and the dangerous work they had done together. But now Mike's daughter was reaching out, looking for connection and closure, and Thomas found himself facing a choice he had never expected to have to make. The quiet cafeteria around them seemed to fade into the background as Thomas contemplated the implications of what he had just learned. His carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the past he had worked so hard to leave behind. Thomas stared at the manila folder on the table between them, knowing that it likely contained details about his service record and information about Sarah Reynolds. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and the distant sounds of the kitchen cleanup crew provided a backdrop to what felt like one of the most important conversations of his civilian life. After several minutes of silence, he looked up to meet Admiral Patterson's patient gaze. "Tell me about her," Thomas said quietly. "Tell me about Mike's daughter." Admiral Patterson opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table to Thomas. The image showed a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and kind eyes that reminded Thomas immediately of her father. She was smiling at the camera while standing next to a young man in a Marine dress uniform, obviously her fiancé. There was something about her expression that conveyed both strength and compassion. "Sarah Marie Reynolds," Admiral Patterson began. "She's 32 years old, graduated from the University of Virginia with a degree in social work. She's been working with veteran services for almost 10 years now, specifically focusing on special operations personnel who are having difficulty adjusting to civilian life." Thomas studied the photograph, seeing so much of Mike in his daughter's features. Mike had often talked about his little girl during their long deployments, showing pictures and telling stories about her school activities and achievements. To see her as a grown woman, dedicated to helping veterans, created an unexpected emotional response in Thomas. "She never married before?" Thomas asked, noting what appeared to be an engagement ring in the photograph. "No, she was very focused on her education and career. Her fiancé, Captain David Chen, is a Marine intelligence officer. They met through her work with veterans. Apparently, he was helping some of his Marines connect with support services, and they got to know each other professionally before it became personal." Thomas nodded, appreciating the fact that Sarah had found someone who would understand the unique challenges that came with loving someone connected to the military world. "And she's been looking for me specifically?" Admiral Patterson pulled out a handwritten letter from the folder. "She's been looking for several of her father's team members. You're actually the third one I've helped locate. The others have already agreed to attend the wedding." He paused, watching Thomas's reaction carefully. "She wrote this letter for you, hoping that we'd be able to find you." Thomas accepted the letter with trembling hands, noting his name written in careful script across the front of the envelope. For a moment, he just held it, understanding that opening it would represent a point of no return in his carefully maintained isolation from his military past. "Go ahead," Admiral Patterson encouraged, gently. "She's a wonderful woman, Thomas. I think you'll find that her father raised her well." Thomas opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Sarah's handwriting was clear and easy to read, and her words were thoughtful and direct. "Dear Mr. Martinez," the letter began, "my name is Sarah Reynolds, and I am the daughter of Lieutenant Commander Michael Reynolds. I hope this letter finds you well and that you'll forgive me for reaching out to you after all these years. My father spoke of you often during my childhood, always with tremendous respect and affection. He told me stories about your service together, about your courage and your loyalty to your teammates. More importantly, he told me that you saved his life on more than one occasion, ensuring that he came home safely to our family." Thomas paused in his reading, feeling the weight of memories he had worked so hard to suppress. Mike had indeed been in danger multiple times during their deployments, and Thomas had been there to help him through some very difficult situations. But he had always considered that simply part of the job, nothing that deserved special recognition or gratitude. The letter continued. "I am writing to invite you to my wedding on June 15th. I know this might seem like an unusual request from someone you've never met, but you were such an important part of my father's life that I hope you might consider being part of this special day. My fiancé and I would be honored to have you there, not just as a guest, but as someone who helped make our family possible by bringing my father home safely." Thomas looked up at Admiral Patterson, who was watching him with understanding eyes. "She doesn't know anything about the specifics of our missions, does she?" "No," the Admiral confirmed. "Mike was smart about operational security, even with his family. She knows he served in special operations, and she knows it was dangerous work, but the details of your missions remain classified. What she knows comes from the personal stories her father shared about the men he served with, not the tactical details of what you did." Thomas appreciated this confirmation. Mike had always been professional about maintaining security protocols, even when talking with his family about his service. This meant that Sarah's interest in meeting him was based on personal connection rather than curiosity about classified operations. The letter concluded, "I understand if you prefer to maintain your privacy. My father always spoke about how difficult it could be for special operations veterans to transition to civilian life, and I respect that everyone handles that transition differently. But if you're willing to meet with me, even briefly, I would be grateful for the chance to thank you in person for everything you did to protect my father and to hear any stories about him that you might be willing to share. Regardless of your decision about the wedding, please know that our family will always be grateful for your service and your friendship with my father." Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table next to the photograph. The cafeteria around them had grown completely quiet now, with the kitchen staff having finished their cleanup duties and departed for the night. Only the security lighting remained on, casting long shadows across the empty dining area. "What happened to the other team members she found?" Thomas asked. Admiral Patterson smiled. "Both of them were initially hesitant, just like you, but after meeting with Sarah, they both decided to attend the wedding. In fact, one of them, Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, has become something of a mentor to her fiancé. They've been meeting regularly to discuss leadership and military culture." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding how meaningful such connections could be. The bonds formed during Special Operations service were unlike anything in civilian life, and the idea that his former teammates were beginning to reconnect with that part of their past was both encouraging and intimidating. "I haven't talked about those days in 15 years, Thomas said quietly. "I'm not sure I even remember how to discuss that part of my life with someone who wasn't there." "Sarah understands that," Admiral Patterson assured him. "She's not looking for war stories or detailed mission reports. She's looking for personal connections, for insights into her father as a leader and as a man, the kind of things that only someone who served closely with him would know." Thomas thought about the Mike Reynolds he had known during their deployments. He had been an exceptional officer, someone who cared deeply about his men and who never asked them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. Mike had been known for his sense of humor during difficult times, his ability to keep morale up when missions went long and dangerous, and his genuine concern for the welfare of every person under his command. Mike was a good man, Thomas said finally. One of the best officers I ever served under. He deserved to make it home to his family. Sarah knows that, Admiral Patterson replied. And she knows that you played a role in making sure that happened. She's not trying to make you uncomfortable or to put you in situations you'd rather avoid. She just wants to express her gratitude and to learn more about her father from someone who knew him well. Thomas picked up the photograph again, studying Sarah's face and thinking about the life Mike had been able to live because he had survived their deployments. What's she like? Personally, I mean. Admiral Patterson's expression softened with obvious affection. She's remarkable, Thomas. She has her father's sense of duty and his compassion for others. Her work with veterans has been genuinely transformative for many of the people she's helped. She has a gift for understanding the challenges that military people face when transitioning to civilian life. Probably because she grew up in a military family and saw those challenges firsthand. And her fiancé? Captain Chen is a good man. I've met him several times now, and I can see why Sarah chose him. He understands the military culture, he respects what she's trying to accomplish with her work, and he clearly adores her. Mike would have approved of him. Thomas considered this information carefully. The idea of attending a wedding, of being in a social situation where people might ask questions about his past, felt overwhelming after so many years of anonymity. But the thought of disappointing Mike's daughter, of turning down her gracious invitation, also troubled him deeply. If I were to meet with her, Thomas said slowly, it would just be a conversation, right? No formal events or ceremonies or anything like that? Absolutely, Admiral Patterson confirmed. She suggested meeting at a quiet restaurant or coffee shop, somewhere comfortable and private. Just the two of you, unless you'd prefer that I be there as well. She wants you to feel completely at ease with whatever arrangement works best for you. Thomas sat quietly for several more minutes, weighing his options and considering the implications of reconnecting with this part of his past. His current life was peaceful and predictable, free from the complications and memories that had once dominated his days. But it was also somewhat isolated and disconnected from the relationships that had once been so important to him. Would I have to talk to the other team members who are attending the wedding? Thomas asked. Only if you want to, Admiral Patterson replied. Sarah is coordinating the invitations, but she's not trying to organize any kind of reunion or group gathering. Each person's participation is completely individual and based on their own comfort level. Thomas understood the wisdom of this approach. Not everyone processed their military experience in the same way, and forcing interactions between people who might be at different stages of dealing with their past could be counterproductive for everyone involved. Admiral, Thomas said finally, I need some time to think about this. It's been a very long time since I've had to consider anything like this. Of course, Patterson replied, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card. Take all the time you need. Sarah's wedding is still several weeks away, so there's no immediate pressure. When you're ready, you can call me directly, or if you prefer, Sarah included her contact information in the envelope with her letter. Thomas accepted the business card and noted that Admiral Patterson had written his personal cell phone number on the back. Thank you for taking the time to find me and to explain all of this in person. You could have just sent a letter or made a phone call. Admiral Patterson stood and began gathering his papers back into the manila folder. Thomas, after what you boys did during your service, the least I could do was deliver this message properly. Besides, I wanted to meet you personally. Mike spoke very highly of you during the few times our paths crossed professionally. This revelation surprised Thomas. He had no memory of Admiral Patterson from his service days, but it was certainly possible that their commands had overlapped in ways he wasn't aware of. The special operations community was relatively small, and senior officers often knew more about individual operators than the operators realized. "I should get going," Thomas said, standing and straightening his civilian clothes. "My shift starts early tomorrow morning." Admiral Patterson shook his hand firmly. "Thomas, whatever you decide about the wedding, I want you to know that your service mattered. What you and Mike and the rest of your team did made a difference. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Thomas nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness that he hadn't experienced in many years. As he walked toward the exit, he could feel the weight of Sarah's letter in his pocket and the business card in his hand. For the first time in 15 years, his carefully maintained separation from his military past had been challenged, and he wasn't sure how he was going to respond. The walk home through the quiet base streets gave Thomas time to think about everything Admiral Patterson had told him. The stars were visible overhead, and the familiar sounds of a military installation settling down for the night surrounded him. As he reached his small apartment and prepared for bed, Thomas realized that regardless of what he decided about Sarah's invitation, his anonymous life as just another cafeteria worker had come to an end. 3 weeks later, Thomas Martinez stood in the reception hall of a hotel in Virginia, wearing a suit he had purchased specifically for the occasion. Across the room, he could see Sarah Reynolds Chen in her wedding dress, radiant with happiness as she danced with her new husband. When she had spotted Thomas earlier during the ceremony, her face had lit up with genuine joy and gratitude. Their conversation the week before had been everything Admiral Patterson had promised: warm, respectful, and focused on celebrating the memory of Lieutenant Commander Michael Reynolds. As Thomas watched the celebration, he felt a sense of closure and connection that he hadn't experienced in many years. Mike's daughter had grown into an exceptional woman, and her wedding day was a perfect tribute to the life her father had been able to live because he had come home safely from his deployments. For the first time since his retirement, Thomas felt proud of his service and grateful for the bonds he had formed during those difficult years. The old soldier who had been serving food quietly had finally found his way back to the family he had helped protect so many years ago. But as he reached for the exit door, he heard a voice behind him calling out softly but clearly. "Excuse me." Thomas paused, his hand on the door handle, and slowly turned around. The visiting commander was standing now, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Could I have a word with you?" the man asked, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Thomas felt his stomach tighten slightly, but he nodded and walked back toward the table where the commander waited. Whatever this was about, he had a feeling his quiet, anonymous life was about to become much more complicated.